Okay, well, let's get started. To start off, can you just state your name and where you're from?
Sure. Harvey C. Jewett from Aberdeen, South Dakota.
And I'm Tony Venhuizen. I'm doing this interview today for the South Dakota State Historical Society, and you understand that this is being recorded for historical purposes.
I do, and anything I say can be used against me, right?
Right.
Yeah, okay.
So Harvey, the focus of our project here is really on South Dakota politics in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s.
Okay.
Kind of connect through Mickelson, Biller, return of Janklow era.
Right.
I know you were in the state and active through that entire period. So maybe before we get into that, can you just briefly give a little of your background, where you're from and your family's history in Aberdeen, and kind of
Sure.
what you were doing in the Aberdeen in the early 70s? Again, this isn't the focus, but give a short overview.
Yeah. My great-grandfather came out to Aberdeen in 1881. Came out, got off at Aberdeen, which was as far as the Chicago-Milwaukee Railroad tracks went that year. So he either got there in July or October. Both those dates are used. His father was a grocer in Newark, Ohio. So he started a grocery store, the Red Front Store, in 1881, and sold that in 82, and brought his brother out. Brother out in late 82. They started in the beginning of 83 a wholesale house. The name was Jewett Brothers. And they did business under Jewett Brothers until the late 30s, early 40s. So they started in Aberdeen. That was the time of the Great Sioux Indian Reservation. So the Missouri River was the boundary, which wasn't very far away. And the railroads at the time would not build on Indian land. I know something about that because I clerked for Judge Bogue, and that issue was litigated, how the restrictions in the Great Sioux Reservation and what happened thereafter, those cases, on whether the reservations, as they opened them, whether that meant non-Indians could go on the reservation of a constant size, or the reservation shrunk. And the rulings ultimately were the reservation shrunk. And a big part of that evidence that was signed up the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeal was Judge Bogue, and then the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals, and ultimately the U.S. Supreme Court, were railroad records about not going on Indian land. But it was, Jewett Brothers had a contract with the Department of Defense and sold out on the reservations food, and but it was bigger than that. They sold plowshares and clothes, and in apple season, they'd get apples and sell them around. Tobacco, booze, but back then that was, although it was the start of the Jewett Drug Company, it was mostly booze. all these elixirs and things. Then 1889, they built a warehouse and building in Sioux Falls, which is still here on Main Street. It's an office building now, but it's essentially the same design as the building in Aberdeen. There's a lot of stone in this building. Here, it's all brick in Aberdeen. So anyway, that's 89. My grandfather went away to school and college, and then came back. And my great-grandfather kind of retired to Florida for 5 or 6 months a year, and my grandfather ran the business. And so he, and I should mention, my great-grandfather sent my grandfather away to high school. He went to the public schools in Aberdeen until after 8th grade, and then he went to Campion Jesuit High School, which was a real hardcore college prep operation in Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin. So he went there, and later my father went there, and my father's brother, and then I did. So, and then the Jesuits closed it because they kind of ran out of priests to populate. That was just a high school by itself, and they kept in operation the high schools that were part of a Jesuit college, like Creighton and Marquette and places like that. Anything named Loyola or Xavier or Gonzaga or any of those original Jesuits. My grandfather went to World War I, was in that, and not in a combat role, but ran ambulances and first aid as such. It was very different than it is today. And one of his ambulance drivers was Walt Disney, and they stayed in touch and were good friends all those years. And his sister, so that would be my great aunt, I guess, was also there. Volunteered, was a nurse in the hospital there. So we had 2 of the 3 kids. The other kid was Ange, and I live in Ange's old house. So it was just kind of what was available. I didn't really start out to buy an old Druid house, but it was and I did find, ultimately, I found a picture of Ange when she was about 21, and she really was a gorgeous young lady, because she wasn't when she was a little overweight and grumpy old lady when I knew her. But anyway, so then my dad graduated from that same high school, went on to college in World War II, and back, and ran Jewett Brothers, which had changed its name to Jewett Wholesale Direct. And that really started to happen in the 30s. And in the late 30s, the Sioux Falls house closed, and a company called Manchester Biscuit Company, which they owned at the time, which was in Sioux Falls, that was sold to somebody. the food business was sold to a budding company, Red Owl Wholesale. So that the food went there, and the liquor and wholesale drugs were left, and then the Pure Food and Drug Acts, the Roosevelt administration really made that company that it be licensed, and the whole bureaucracy, and although at first, and even when I worked there in the 60s in the warehouse, there were old lineaments that were 90% booze. We sold them in all the retail drugstores in North South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, and a little bit of Minnesota, a little tiny bit of Iowa, and a little section around Omaha in Nebraska. So I went to that high school. I was on my way to Boston College, which is a Jesuit operation, and just kind of at the end in August, I decided to go to Vermilion. And so I went to USD for undergraduate school and then law school. After law school, I worked for Judge Andrew Bogue, as I mentioned. He was a wonderful man and a great man to work for.
What year would that have been?
Say again?
What year did you graduate law school and then work for Judge Bogue?
73.
So
And
let's talk a little more about that, because some of our other interviews have gotten into the AIM and everything that went on with that in the early 70s. Can you go into a little more detail about, you were right in the middle of that when you were working there as a clerk?
Yeah, I was. I viewed it all as kind of one thing. I had edited an article on the Indian jurisdiction, and a part of that article addressed the feeling of unease on the reservations. So then that happened. I wasn't there in the seizure and when the FBI kind of locked them in. At least our impression was that they had no intention of staying there. But the FBI blocked all the roads, so okay, we'll stay there. I was there just at the end of the surrender, and so it wasn't quite cleaned up when I was there, but it got that way. So at that point, there were only 2 federal judges in South Dakota. Judge Fred Nichols in Sioux Falls and Andrew Bogue in Rapid City. So, and AIM was the American Indian Movement, was the moving party there. AIM had earlier taken over the BIA headquarters in Washington, D.C., and got a lot of publicity. And then they took over Alcatraz and got some more publicity, and had some big celebrity name supporters and whatnot. And then they took over the courthouse in Custer, which caused a stink around here. And then came Wounded Knee, and it was just a bizarre thing. they took the leadership to Minneapolis, changed the venue of the trial, moved it to Minneapolis, St. Paul. And so Judge Fred Nichols went to Minneapolis, which left Andrew Bogue as the only federal judge in the state. And in those days, they passed a Speedy Trial Act. And they had to try you, I believe, in 180 days it was. Try to, on the just regular crimes that the federal government had, it was hard to do because there was just one judge. And then about 600 defendants, non-leadership defendants from the Wounded Knee takeover, and then a variety of civil cases. It was when I first came to work for Judge Bogue, the courthouse was still in Deadwood. That was the original federal courthouse in the state of South Dakota. And so we still tried cases in that old place. And ultimately, while I was there, the new federal courthouse was finished. So we moved in, and then they moved us out so they could come in and put lead all over in the doors and the judge's bench. Not for Tom Barnes and I, our little place where we sat in the trials. There's no lead there. But they gave us guns, so we had, and marshal's badges, so we had, I was never too sure we were supposed to have those. There's something about, separation of powers and why we ended up with badges, except that's how we took the pistols that they gave us, the marshals gave us. That's how we took those on planes, because we had a little wallet that had that marshal's ID and badge. So it was a very different time. We didn't, the two law clerks, Tom Barnes, a close friend of mine from undergraduate school, he's passed away now, he's from Mitchell. The two of us were classmates. He was a year ahead of me, but classmates in the SAE house and then law school. And he'd been to, in the interim there, he'd been to Vietnam. And kind of came back dinged up more kind of emotionally than physically. So we were it though. We went Deadwood one week, and then went to Aberdeen the next, and went to Sioux Falls the next, and Pierre the next, and Deadwood, and I ran the civil calendar for Judge Bogue, and so I had a list of cases that were ready to go on a moment's notice. We sent out a note and said, it's the only ones that are going to get heard. Well, this Wounded Knee stuff is going on, and we only have one judge, so get us a list, tell us, because we'll give you notice in maybe only 24 hours. And if you can't do it, we'll have to go to the next person. So there were things like that, and we'd have things cancel, and we could stick in a civil case, which I went out there originally because that's where they tried all kinds of civil cases and not criminal cases. So and we only tried about 3 civil cases. But we tried, Judge Bogue intentionally scheduled good lawyers. So the trials we had in Rapid City had Joe Butler and Porter, and people like that. Sioux Falls, Ellsworth Evans, Deming Smith. really first-class lawyers. So it was an experience, and in law school, the dean sent me up to Sioux Falls to talk to Lou Hurwitz of the Davenport, Evans, Hurwitz and Smith law firm, and I did work for them at freshman year, just research kind of things. But in the second year, they had me up to try some lawsuits, nothing very weighty or big, but I tried lawsuits. And they gave me, some cases were just losers. And but I had two that I'd lost. One was an insurance case, life insurance case. And what do you do about alcohol? And then there really were two answers, so you kind of get to pick your answer and preach it to the Supreme Court. And the other was a young man who had driven his car into a rather immobile tree and hurt himself, so the ambulances came, which means the police came, and the car was just full to the brim with marijuana. And that was back in the days when they didn't have any sense of humor about that. And he was charged then with a felony. And there was no question about the search. There was no, there wasn't any real way around it. And Larry Pearsall gave me the case, and he said, "This is hopeless. Just look at everything. Just look at everything." And so I started at the very beginning, how it was introduced in the legislature, and by God, they merged it with another bill, and Hog House, as they call it. They merged it and didn't change the name. And the Constitution then, and still does, require that the name accurately reflect what it was. And I think it was a hog confinement control bill that really was the narcotics control, for humans. And so I made that motion that the whole thing was unconstitutional, which the trial judge huffed at. And so they gave me that case to go to the Supreme Court. So as a junior, I argued two cases at the Supreme Court, and I won them both. And they sent me $1,000, and I bought two bicycles and a side of beef. So
the effect of that was the marijuana criminal statute was set aside?
Yep, they set it aside, and I let a whole bunch of people out, and it was years before I'd walk into a bar and somebody'd send me a drink. It just materialized in there. So
well, let's kind of go back a little bit. One thing I wanted to mention before we go on: you grew up in Aberdeen, really the same age as Tom Daschle, right?
Yes. You
talked a little about knowing him growing up, or
yeah, I'm a young Catholic boy, as is Tom, and his family was very active in the Catholic Church, and my mother was. My father, not so much, but he was a churchgoer. But I think there was a gathering at Ray Engler's drugstore every Sunday at 11 o'clock, and Ray had a beer license. They'd go to Mass, and then they'd go to Engler Drug for discussion. And so I used to go with my dad. And I'd get to have a cherry Coke when I was there. But, we were with Dashels a lot, and he was he's an Aberdeen guy. We weren't in the same class, so it's, heaven forbid that you be too close of friends if you're back then. It's probably still true, but slightly, in high school you're divided up. Nice guy. He wasn't a big athlete. He wasn't a big scholar, but he was a nice guy. I went to Brookings. They had ROTC, which he joined in the Air Force. They had both Air Force and Army, ROTC. So he was there, but he was in the kind of crowd that drank a little beer, and sometimes had to go north of town to a gravel pit to drink that beer. He was an habituant of that environment. He's a nice guy, and is today a nice guy. He's a good sense of humor, I think he brought that was his image in South Dakota until he was majority leader, minority leader, and then I guess their job is to get on TV and be a jerk every night, because I think it changed his whole image in South Dakota, and that's why I lost. I think that's why Thune beat him. I think I'm right on that. I mean, every night, the state voted for Bush, and every night he was on TV calling him everything but human. And kind of unnecessarily so. But he's still a nice guy when he came back to town.
So going back to that early 70s, it's interesting because South Dakota's always been very Republican.
Yeah.
And then you get to 1968, 1970, 72, McGovern is in the Senate. Carl Lund had his stroke. Both of the congressmen go Democrat, and then Dick Connect gets elected governor.
Yeah.
Why do you think the Democrats were able to take over at that time? And how did that change things, that the 1970s was this period of Democratic control?
It did, and it wasn't just the governor. They took over control of the House, and then they had the presiding officers as the lieutenant governor in the Senate. So, they had the whole thing. Aberdeen was very a hotbed of Democratic. Herseth's farm was up there, and the Herseth family he's the governor, the Democratic governor before, and he was around there, still a big deal.
Aberdeen really had a very strong legislative delegation at that time.
Well, Joe Barnett was there at that time, and led that delegation with their guys like E.C. Peploe and Bud Woods, and Peg Lamont, and they had good people, and then no shrinking violets. They got stuff done. Joe Barnett, from the beginning. So I knew, Joe Barnett and I were in the same law firm, or I was in his law firm, more accurately. And he told me that he read every single bill, regardless of who introduced it and what it was about. And he was in the House, he was always in the position either as Speaker or the leader to kind of have something to say about what got a hearing or what got a vote. But I think he was a good Republican, and he had firm beliefs, but he wasn't adverse to bringing a Democrat bill up if it was a good bill. Every now and then they found an acorn to the old blind hog deal. And Lars Herseth there for a while was the leader in I want to say the Senate, he from Aberdeen. He went to Lars for the bills that were in the Senate. We went and talked to him, not the Republicans. But it was a strong place, and unfortunately, it struggled a little bit that way. I don't really. And it might be that they were so strong that they didn't bring along a ready body of people to take on the task. That was always my pet theory anyway, why we just dropped off the face of the earth, and it still do to a large degree.
You've really known pretty well every governor going back to the 70s at least.
Yeah, I knew Knipe because I knew him through Barnett, but I wasn't very active there. But I really, my first active was Janklow 1, and I knew him he was in law school. He was ahead of me, but I had friends that were in law school with him, and so I ended up, in those days he drank a lot. So he was kind of out on the town. So I knew him very well. And, he graduated, he went, most people don't know that he went to Rosebud, and he was the first actual hire in the Indian Legal Aid program of the federal government. And he did it in Rosebud, and that's where he met Means, and they were buddies until Wounded Knee. That strained their relationship pretty severely until just before they both died. Means called him, in that month before he died, and they kind of talked and decided Means was dying of cancer, and decided that they shouldn't leave the earth being enemies, and so they had several conversations, and Bill liked it. So I was active there, and then with Mickelson.
You represented Mickelson.
I did. He was my client. He got sued for malpractice. Terrible lawsuit. It was awful. I mean, awful in the sense it was not correct. And so we tried the case in the week before the election. His campaign manager every night would come in and when the day was over, and he'd say, if you lose this case, he's going to lose the election. Well, that's nice of you, because there isn't any pressure going on in the trial anyway, so I just needed that little jolt. But we won. We tried the case, and George was a good client. I tried a lot of professional liability cases, doctors, lawyers, engineers, architects, veterinarians. And George was a good a good client. He didn't try the case, and didn't whisper in my ear during the trial. So he'd write notes, but he didn't whisper. You're trying a lawsuit, you got to hear the question and the answer, and it's hard to do when somebody's talking. So as a second chair, I'm terrible, and I also whisper in people's ear. So I was a notorious poor second choice in the law firm. And Joe Barnett was worse than I am.
You talk a little about when Joe died, how that all happened.
Joe Barnett?
Yeah.
I was in the office that night, and Rory King was in the office that night, and Joe Barnett showed up, and he'd been in Brookings meeting with Mickelson. And so he sat there and we all had a drink, and then he stayed, and Rory and I left, and he had AFib, it's called, I guess. And he took medicine for it. He was very quiet about it. He had gone home, and he was asleep, and Kathy, his wife, was reading, and she heard him just kind of grunt, and kind of lean up, but not all the way up, just kind of a grunt, and looked over at him, and he didn't seem to be moving, and then she didn't think he was breathing, and then he wasn't. So that was it, and they finally got around to calling 911, but there was no way for them to relight him at that point. I got a call from Terry O'Keefe. It was a big shock.
He wasn't even 60.
No, he was just barely 50. So he had his prime working days left, but he had every bad habit that you could, he smoked these terrible big cigars, and he drank, and he got about 4 hours sleep a night, and he had a little high blood pressure, and he worked forever. His kids in school would be on the basketball team or whatever. He'd take a briefcase to the game, and he'd sit up away from the crowd, but in the very top row and work during the game. He did that all the time. And in a trial preparation, you take depositions, which are just the witness is under oath, and you ask them questions to find out what their opinion is, or find out what they know or don't know. And then you have to read them to make sure the court reporter came close anyway to what the answer, you remember the answers to be. So Joe Barnett read depositions if he drove to Sioux Falls. He'd read a deposition. He could...
While he was driving?
While he was driving. And he could drive and then look up and make sure he was on the road, and then go right back to the right spot. He had himself trained for that. And so it'd be the damnedest thing. You'd be sitting there, and he didn't ever really want to talk when you drove with him. He was going to read depositions, and he really was reading them. And your page would turn. He was, in a basketball game, he was reading them. He just was never not working. on Wednesday morning and night during the session, I would come down early in the morning and go through his mail that was received on Monday and Tuesday. And then sometimes I'd come back on Thursday, but Wednesday was the time. And so he'd come back and come to the office Friday night and work all day Saturday and Saturday night, go to Mass on Sunday morning, and go out someplace for breakfast with Kathy and his brood of kids, whoever was around, and then the afternoon he'd spend in the office again, and back to Pier on that night. It was just never. He never had a day off, and he loved it. He just loved it.
Kind of changing topics, one of the things you were involved with in that similar time frame, I think, was the creation of the Student Loan Finance Corporation. Can you kind of talk about what that was and how that came to be?
Yeah. The federal government had a student loan, and I'm going to take a sip here.
Yeah, you can start taking a drink and then over.
Yeah. The federal government had a student loan program, and it just was all screwed up. They didn't know where the loans were and who had what, and they weren't collecting any, and so they decided to just redo the whole thing. And it was the banks, primarily savings and loans as well. Credit unions didn't exist at that time, and if they did exist, not around. So the banks were going to make the loans then. And those loans would be guaranteed by an agency, a nonprofit agency that would be set up, and the governor got to pick who. The parameters of it were pretty much laid out, but they got to pick who would do that, and so the student would apply at the university. The guarantee agency would guarantee it, not the federal government, and so it was that non-government agency that looked at the eligibility and and then kind of watched it to make sure they were a full-time student. And the federal government would pay interest while the student was in school, and that interest was never charged to the student. So they just kind of took over the loan industry because there was no interest charged while the student was in school, and banks, of course, charged interest normally. That was that. But the student loans were so ill-managed before that it was down to the Farmers and Merchants Bank in Aberdeen. It was the only bank in the state making student loans. In that first year of this guarantee agency, it could go broke. People didn't study that very closely, but if it had more than a 5% default rate, they wouldn't pay 100 cents on the dollar that they owed. They pay 98%. Well, if enough go, you can go broke. And ultimately, our friends in Minnesota did. And then George Bush Sr., they should have, and the way it was set up is the banks over there wouldn't have had a guarantee. The guarantee agency had a guarantee from the federal government, but not the banks. And of course, the federal government tipped over and paid them anyway, which caused problems later. But so that was in South Dakota, the Education Assistance Corporation. Dick Knipe picked the Aberdeen group, and with a little help from Joe Barnett, and I was kind of sitting in the room with Joe. So that was the guarantee agency, but to get the other banks in so that there was widespread, what's now Dakota Bank, didn't want to make all of the student loans in the state. So the next version was started, and there was no federal money in that. It was all, we borrowed $1 million from what's today U.S. Bank in Aberdeen, and started the Student Loan Finance Company. Actually, it started out as the South Dakota Student Loan Finance Company. And its function in life was to, started out servicing the loans, but quickly became the buyer of the loans from banks. These were $2,000 loans now, so they cost as much to service and take care of as a $100,000 loan. They weren't really economic for a bank, but they were good business getters. So Student Loan Finance Corporation became the entity that while the student was in school, the federal government paid the interest quarterly and just paid it. But you had to bill it. So they would bill it, and the banks would, and Student Loan Finance would do that for them, would just service those. The banks didn't have to pay any attention to it, and they'd get their check, their interest check. And then when it went into repayment, then they kind of somebody had to do something, track the payments and not payments, and send out the you forgot to pay notices and that kind of thing. So banks really didn't like a $2,000 loan at that point. But Student Loan Finance would buy them then. So the practice was make the loan, keep it until it goes into repayment, and then flip it to Student Loan Finance. And that's all Student Loan Finance did. So it, had a lot of loans and was doing that same thing. And we could make 1 to 1.5% on the book of business net. So that was okay, and it was a economically successful business. And then Barack Obama takes over as president. Clinton had wanted to get he didn't have figured out just exactly, what was going on. He thought that the banks were making too much money, so he wanted to take over the student loans. He just didn't get it done because they did try an experiment. Kind of part of Minnesota's problems was, they couldn't get a loan out. Minnesota the state had to loan money to kids for a couple of months before the federal government could get that out. Anyway, that didn't work. But so then Obama did it, and they also contracted with outside companies, but not one for every state. I think there's 3 in the nation. One acquired. South Dakota had just a great reputation in that world. It was, had the lowest default rate and the lowest cost of doing business, and it really was very good. So when all that transpired, then I think it's like Great Lakes, I think is the name of the Wisconsin entity, just grew and ate other states, and so Great Lakes still has a building in it. It's a pretty small operation up there now, but it's still there. So they redid the whole thing. They are now talking about, because President Biden wants to forgive them all, which was not the program. In fact, it was, in terms of cash flow, it was better in the old days where the bank made the loan. So the federal government had no money in it except that interest. They always paid that interest. But that was way cheaper than funding the whole thing and then eating the defaults. And of course, with Biden, he's going to give it all away. He won't collect it anyway. So it would make sense to have it go back to the banks. The federal government, which never deals in cash flow, it's anathema to say, does this cash flow? They'll get up and run out of the room. So it is better if they go back to that. It would lower the cash flow requirement of the federal government.
The other very well-known thing that you were involved from, really, I think almost from the very beginning, was Super 8.
Yeah.
Can you talk about how that started and what your role was, and tell that story a little bit?
Yeah, it's a unique story, but I think it's typical of people. I came back to Aberdeen, and after Judge Bogue, then I went in the Army, and the war was really winding down at that point. But they were still sending troops over there. And the troops really didn't have much of a mission. They just don't lose. It was a hard time. The Army had big drug problems and big race problems, and the Army didn't want to be there, and the country didn't want them there. But they were still there. And so they're there till July well, I was in, I graduated 73, then 74 with Bogue, and 75. So July 75. It's over when they left from the roof in the helicopter. But guys that were in the service in 75, 74, they still have on their grave marker, military grave marker, the Vietnam War. So I got done with Bogue, and I immediately got, you get an offer to go into the JAG, Judge Advocates Corps, as a lawyer for the Army, but that was 6 years. And so I didn't know anybody that took that. So the Army gave you infantry. So what's your highest and best use in the Army? If you've been to law school, and a judge's law clerk, an editor of the Law Review, and infantry commander, that's the highest and best use. So that's what I was. And I had my orders for Vietnam, and then I was in a tank that kind of rolled over. I got a really abrupt stop and rolled over, and I screwed up my back, so I couldn't carry a pack for a while, and so you really are worthless in the Army if you can't carry a pack. So I ran rifle ranges at Fort Benning for a while, and then they said, you know, you're a captain, and you haven't, and I was a captain, and I hadn't been to Vietnam, and every officer, infantry officer, that went to Vietnam came back, unless they really screwed the pooch, came back as a captain. So they had captains coming out their ears, and they just didn't need them all. So they said to me, why don't you go home, and you'll be in, we'll get you in a reserve unit. I said, good enough. So I took that early out and came home. Then they discovered and told me that they couldn't put me in a unit that was either out of state or more than 200 miles or whatever. There was a range. I could have gone to Omaha and joined that infantry unit. Well, I looked into that, and that was a Green Beret unit, which I did not qualify for. I would have to go back to, one, I would have never gotten an invitation from them, but two, if I had to go back to Fort Benning, where they mint Green Berets, and so I didn't do that. And then they couldn't make you change branches. So Aberdeen's got a big transportation branch, but I didn't know it. One, I didn't know a carburetor from a box of rocks, so it was not going to be anything of interest to me, and so I didn't do that. So I was in a ready reserve unit, 48 hours notice, and I got that first year. I got notice to go to Fort Leonard Wood, where I could see Geronimo's grave and the marker for the 5th principal meridian. So anybody that used to examine abstracts knows what that means. That's what the Army Corps of Engineers surveyed the whole, from the Mississippi to the Rocky Mountains, and they did it. You know, they went out, had those chains that they put out. They did it, and it works today. There's some mistakes, but it's pretty much done. And it didn't. That was also a part of the lawsuit on the Indian jurisdiction, because they didn't survey Indian lands. So, and it turns out Rosebud, for example, was not surveyed. So it was just another item in the list of what indicated that it had been Indian lands, and then they had made arrangements to survey it. It hadn't been done, but they had made arrangements, but it hadn't been done. That was maybe not helpful in the case, but they decided to survey it. Anyway, Leonard Wood, and then they canceled it, so I didn't go. And then they just kind of, once a year, I'd get a card, you know, to have your arms and legs and stuff, so I fill that out, send it in. And I never got called, and someday, I don't know, just one day it appeared, my honorable discharge, so. And then my records, twice, have been stolen from St. Louis, where my permanent records are, so I've been warned twice. My social security number was really, that was my service number, it was on my uniforms, fatigues, or identified you by your social security number. So anyway, that's a diversion from the student loan world and whatnot. And then the student loan becomes Great Plains when they.
So talk a little about Super 8 then.
Yeah, okay, Super 8. So I came back, I got out early and I came back in '74. And one of my first clients, well, my very first client was the only Democratic friend that my dad had. And as I told you before, my dad couldn't even say Democrat. He called them those people, except Harry Truman, he liked him. And he liked Gordy Bell, who was my first client. But a secretary in Siegel Barnett was Ron Rivet's wife. And so I met Ron Rivet that way. And then the two guys that started it were Brown and Rivet. And so in November of that year of '74 is my first bill to those guys. And it's dealing with, they acquired the land, or were trying to, that is where the first Super 8 was built. At 6th Avenue, Highway 12 and Roosevelt. So that land was a bit of a mess, and I got that straightened out. So that then started. So through my wife, I knew Brown. Through the office, I knew Rivet, and Ron came in and hired me to take care of the Super 8's legal work. And at first it was just motels, like we were just talking about. The second motel was down in Huron, and third one in Mitchell. And then they wanted to sell those to fund some more motels. And so that's when we started talking about franchises. So we had not incorporated them separately when they were built, but we did then, and sold them with a franchise, and built Yankton and Sioux Falls and Pierre with those monies, and Rapid City a little while later. But that was the start of the franchising. And in the middle of all that, Dennis Brown had talked to a guy about a franchise in Rochester, Minnesota. And Dennis decided that we weren't registered in Minnesota. And you had to be, in most states you had to be, not all. But we weren't in Minnesota yet. And Dennis had decided that if he took the money in Sioux Falls, that we didn't need to be registered. Well, that's just not right, and they just found out about it, and I thought we were all going to jail. It was just the worst mess. And I got that done, and we were saved by the fact that the guy wanted the franchise. So we gave him the money back, and gave him the offering circular, and he promptly gave us the money back, so we were okay. But it was not a popular thing. And so at that point I was downtown, I was in the law firm, but I really was a general counsel for Super 8, and I could and did give directions to employees, and they followed, and they knew I was somebody they had to listen to. So in '76, we hired the Super 8 headquarters consisted of Dennis Brown moved to California in '76, so it's Rivet and me and a guy by the name of Mike Guin, who was a CPA in town. He was a really, really smart guy. He's a brother of John Guin, who was an assistant attorney general forever and handled their water law, which is an arcane thing, and Indian law and whatnot. He was a great guy, Mike was our chief financial officer, and he kind of had the same. He was with Harlan Peterson, but that ended up in Ide Bailey, and so he was a partner there. But the same arrangement at Super 8. So we did that, and it just went on. And then in '78, we hired Dennis Bale, who became the first real executive that sat in the office and ran the business, and he hired Lawrence Steele, and Dennis Brown died, so it was Rivet, Bale, Steele, Ewan, and Jewett were the five that ran that company. Bale retired. He just ran out of gas and bought him out. So at the end, the last 500 motels were just the four of us. Mike Ewan died shortly after the sale. And Mike Ewan, when he retired, he lived next door to Arnold Palmer in Indian Wells.
When was the sale of Super 8?
95.
And how many hotels at that point?
1,000. We opened the 1,000th motel like a week after the closing of this transaction. So,
talk a little bit. You've told me before about how in the early days, how they would site those hotels.
Yeah. Well, we were awful. We knew you should do site work. You can't just build a motel. But, if there were two companies that we liked, but one we really liked, and that was Holiday Inn. They did all kinds of work. They did studies, traffic studies, and how many people were staying in the little mom and pops, and they had studies about whether the town was going to thrive or not, and so our due diligence was to find a Holiday Inn, and the real intent of Super 8 was to give you a Super 8 room with the amenities in that room, but no bar and no restaurant. In those days, they all lost money. And I think, do today, unless you're in, really in the convention business, a big convention center right next door to you, you can get away with not having any of those things, but or having it, you can get away with it. So, I mean, that was our due diligence. We expanded it to include McDonald's later, and we had a deal with McDonald's. They had a very good and vigorous due diligence, and if they found, they needed about 2 acres, and we needed 2.5, 3 more comfortably. If they found properties like that, they'd call us, and we'd say yes and go, and we called them. They didn't always say yes, but they did a lot of the time. So those were 2 big money savers for us, and we never put a big giant department together. We had 2 guys. I mean, we never could quite deliver the size of room. We wanted to give you a Holiday Inn room, no bar, no restaurant, and at half the price. And we did half the price, but we couldn't have the room quite be the same room. So it was smaller, and still is today. I'm still on the Super 8 board today. I can't. Every year I offer to resign, and I say, well, you ought to stay 1 more year. And they pay my way to the convention, and they have a golf tournament. They pay my way to that. When Tiger Woods played in the golf tournament, they gave me a pass to walk with Tiger inside the ropes. It was a nice little spiff, and although Tiger wasn't the most talkative fellow that I've ever met in my life, didn't talk to me, didn't talk to his caddy either. Did talk to himself a lot, but he has a kind of a strong vocabulary and colorful language. So anyway, that was particularly fun, the tournament. But it was being in that, I was forced to know something about real estate in every state. I was, because Rivet was a madman for always having an ocean-going boat. I had to go to these seminars, really kind of detailed seminars in maritime law, which was not taught at the University of South Dakota. So I knew the law, and there's some real oddball stuff that you would never have imagined. That every maritime country is, maritime being on an ocean, saltwater body of water, is signed up, and one of the parts to it is, because in the 1700s, they signed a guy on to be a seaman, and they'd get over to Calcutta or something, and they'd sell the ship, and they wouldn't pay anybody. So if a ship is an ocean-going ship, has left the jurisdiction and then come back into a jurisdiction and comes into harbor, they have to tender all of their pay and benefits in cash. And if they don't, the seaman can go to the authorities, seize the ship, and sell it. And the freight that it's got, free and clear of any liens. So everybody does that, but it builds up. So Rivet would leave in San Diego and go to Ecuador. Okay, but nobody took it, but maybe we only needed $25,000. And then he'd go down, you know, to Santiago. And now maybe it was 50. And then go over to Tahiti, it was 100. Well, it built up. The first time I went down, when I went to Australia, I went down and I had a box with me that had $200,000 in it. You better believe when we asked, well, the first time we asked for $50,000 in $100 bills, we got a visit from the Secret Service and the Federal Reserve. They wanted to know what we wanted to do with that money. We eventually solved that problem by hiring a Philippine company that supplied the crew. We paid them. They paid the crewman's spouse, did with whatever they wanted to. And the crewman never left the ship, so they maybe had $10 for the whole time they were for 6 months. They just never ever left the ship. So they weren't smoking dope, and we didn't have to test everybody all the time because they were seizing ships. They found a kernel of marijuana. The same with cars. Rental cars had a terrible problem. The dopers would use their own car. They get a Hertz car, and if it got caught, they took Hertz's car. Then Hertz could try to collect from you, but that was iffy. But a big boat, and we got, Rivet's boats they were nice ships. You got boarded all the time. They have a whole herd of dogs they put on board to run around, bark. So we were always, anybody and I mean anybody that left the ship had to give a urine sample to get back on. And you had to have one of the officers watch. So it was a very unpopular duty to say, okay, you've got urinal duty, so you get to watch all these characters pee in a bottle. But, it's too easy to cheat it if you don't do that. So anyway, we caught a couple of guys. So we kicked them right off, fired them, put their stuff in a plastic bag and delivered it to them on the dock, but they were gone.
So, 1995, Super 8 is sold. That's Savior Bill Janklow came back as governor.
Yeah.
And that's when you started your very long tenure on the Board of Regents. Can you talk about how you came to be appointed and
Well, Bill, in his first iteration, he kind of fought with the Regents. I mean, they didn't have a close relationship, and then he put his guys on there, Sertka and that crew went on. But so when he got back, he was leery of the Regents. The Regents had made the change just before I went on of requiring that all the money be deposited with the state. So the universities couldn't have accounts anymore at the local banks. And they hated it. I mean, when I got there, they were trying to get exemptions for this or that. So the Regents wouldn't give them any exemptions. But that really solved a lot of the problems. Because Janklow was always sure that money was leaking to places it shouldn't leak. And I doubt that it was, but it wasn't after that. At least to audit that mess, a real audit would be a Herculean task. But the state has kind of an audit, it's a math audit in the sense your accounts all have to balance. I mean, if you add a column of numbers, it's the right number on the bottom, and it's supposed to be, but it isn't what you know, they make no attempt to go to the file, go to the account and say, show me the bill for this entry, which in an audit they don't do every account on a business audit, but they do select. They go through and you look at your big transactions or whatnot, and then just kind of randomly others. It isn't that well done. I think, so the Regents have had pretty good luck on their chief administrative officers and chief financial officer. But so Bill and I had talked about it a million times, and I was always kind of defensive of universities. I knew those guys. I knew the presidents at USD. I was fairly active in student things and SAE House, and they were always convinced that the fraternities drank too much, and they didn't think so. And so I spent a lot of time with the university presidents. So I was kind of protective, I thought. So one day I was in Indian Wells, California, and I was on the 11th hole, and the pro came in a golf cart and said, "The governor's holding for you on the phone." Well, I knew that wasn't true, but I got in the cart and I went back and talked to whomever, and Bill got on, and he said, "I just put you on the Board of Regents. I just announced it." I said, "Oh God, I don't have time for this." He said, "Oh, it's a just a couple of meetings and a little reading." Well, I finally said, "Okay, I'll try it." So I went there, and I came back, and I went to Pierre, and we sat up all night the way he did, except by now he's not really drinking much. He's changed his ways. So, he would have a beer, a glass of wine every now and then, but he was not drinking. So I was drinking though. So I sit there, he'd drink coffee, and that gal who was a prisoner, she's still around. I can't remember her name now. You must know it. She was something, and she was in jail, a woman's prison, and she came over and started in the kitchen.
Oh, was this Linda Fridley?
Yeah.
Oh, at the governor's mansion, yeah.
Yeah, at the governor's mansion. And she had no big desire to go back to the prison, so she'd stay as late as Bill would work. So she'd serve coffee or whatever, bring apples, So we talked. So anyway, I got on the Regents, and then Bill wanted me to be the president, and he told people that. And he also wouldn't speak to Tad Perry.
Tad was the executive director.
Yeah, executive director of the Regents, and he'd maybe said no to Bill one too many times. So, and you need to know, in the makeup of the government, the governor hires the heads, not the elected people. I mean, the attorney general is elected, but the financial departments, budget departments, all of those people Game Fish and Parks, the governor hires the chief executive there, or whatever they call him, except the Board of Regents. And the Board of Regents, have round figures, 5,000 employees. And the state has round figures 15. It's a little more than 15. But the Regents employ roughly a third of the workforce of the state. And they do work for the Regents. And so when the governor decides to fire them, actually can't fire somebody that works for the Regents. And that's been a source of, for every governor, I got to walk down there and say, nah, it's not happening. So it's a source of some friction as well, But it's so important to get along with the governor. It's just, that is my real job at the Board of Regents, was the care and feeding of the governors. First Bill Janklow and Mike Rounds, and Dennis Daugaard, a little less than even Mickelson. I was, close with him. When I'd go to see Mickelson, I'd buy an extra pack of cigarettes. Governor Mickelson had banned smoking with great fanfare in the Capitol building. He continued to smoke in there. He just didn't buy cigarettes. He smoked my cigarettes. And so I would bring a pack, and he could go through a pack of cigarettes while we met. And he was in that little room. Now, Governor Noem has moved to the bigger, what was the entrance. But that little room, you could fill that up with smoke without trying very hard. And I smoked, and he did. So it was blue at times. Janklow didn't smoke. Rounds didn't. Daugaard didn't. Mickelson, he smoked, and he would smoke cigars too. Those were like Joe Barnett. I think they looked for the cheapest cigars that smelled the worst. That was terrible. So anyway, with Bill, before I actually got to a meeting, I was elected as his secretary. And so I just quickly went through those chairs. Jim Hansen was right in front of me. And then Bill encouraged me to run again, and I did. So I stuck around as president for 10 years, and so that was 12 then, and then I stayed on the board. And when Kristi, the timing was such, I was up after 20 when Governor Noem assumed the governorship, so I went off then.
But the longest serving regent in state history and the longest serving chairman, right?
I believe that's true, and the legislators were so impressed by that they promptly outlawed that. That now you can serve 16 years, I think, or whatever it is. 12 years, and that's it. It's a hard number now. So you have to sit out.
They didn't want anyone to break your record.
Yeah. I don't think I was abusive. I understand the principle of that. As we dealt with presidents, there were guys that I thought had exceeded their sell-by date, And it was, 20 years is a long time for those guys.
The Regents system got a lot stronger as a central system during the time that you and Tad Perry were
Yeah.
running it. Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, I mean, that was intentional. It didn't just happen. It was, and I remember right at first, Governor Janklow would say, well, how much money do you guys spend on advertising? So we'd ask the 6 presidents. And, we'd get wildly different numbers. And it also depended on who you asked. If you asked the president, you got one number. If you asked the chief financial officer, you got a totally different number. If you asked the different department heads, you got a totally different number. And we had to do something there they all had their own charts of account. And a local CPA who had his or her favorite way of doing the numbers. And we didn't have reliable, consistently prepared financial statements. You just have to have that. Because that allows you to compare state and the U are roughly the same size, and they ought to reflect in certain areas the same burden on the students or the state. And the other schools, Northern and Madison and Mines, today they're over 2,000, but less than 3. And then Black Hills sits in the middle. Historically, there'd been kind of in the legislature kind of a very tight group of the 4 small schools. We're all for each other, and that did kind of fall apart during my time. Black Hills decided they'd rather be in state's pocket than anybody else's, I guess. The other thing that militated it was computers. I mean, I'm so old, that we didn't have computers. They had some that were those, weren't really computers. They were those card machines, and you'd punch out cards, and I don't know, I didn't take that course, but I was aware of how that wasn't really a computer. They said it was, but it's not like we have today. And we had to put computers in the dorm and libraries and whatnot that were computers, and they were expensive. The state wouldn't pay for it, so that meant the students were, and we got big donations from generous corporations, but we had to do all of that, and it didn't make sense. And that they all had a different company keeping their books, or a program keeping their books, and a program that handled the classroom materials that a teacher would put on for them to read, or syllabus. You needed one, and you needed one set of books. And once you decide that, you pretty much made the decision on all the rest of it, and it's just follow through. And we successfully got everybody on the same boy. The teachers were mad. Peggy Miller threatened to quit every meeting. She just didn't like that idea of not having her own account. The thing we didn't do, we where it made sense, economic sense, we decided that's the way that we would do it. There are some areas we didn't do. We didn't try to take that through to offerings on the individual campuses. Some of those aren't economic. But we did require there to be 10 people signed up. That was our alternative. So that was not popular on the campuses.
To hold a class.
Yeah, to hold a class, for the class to make up. So we did do a little bit of that. But the place we really didn't do it and should, and they still haven't, is that we ought to be much more deeply, we the Regents, I always still say we after all these years, not me anymore. The Regents should be involved up to their noses in the selection of the chief financial officer and retention. So, we've got a few things there. If there's some disaster where we're not going to make payroll, or the chief financial officers have a commitment to tell the Regents. But, there's not a reporting requirement direct. And the Regents ought to approve that. They don't now. And there ought to be more direct reporting. And you saw the proof of that at Mines. When we went through it later, that school went broke, and literally broke, and couldn't make payroll, and the Regents didn't have a clue, and they decided, the then president, and then executive director decided to invade restricted funds to essentially make payroll. So money that had been contributed to the school or appropriated that was in that restricted account for repair of a building or purchasing a boiler went to pay salaries. Some of those things were financed so that there were publicly sold bonds that said we're rehabbing the building, and the money got spent on salaries. Now then the year cycles and there's another appropriation, and so, but they're still short that money they spent. So what did they do? Still not telling the Regents. The Regents had a little fund of kind of Hail Mary money. It was $3 million, and they spent it. And that's how they balance books. And
we have about 4 minutes left because we have to be done in about 5.
Okay.
So we're not going to get through everything I'd like to on the budget part, but is there any other topic on the Regents tenure that you want to cover, like the Opportunity Scholarship or SDSU moving to Division I is a good story? Or...
Yeah, boy, it sure is. Those are both good stories. I suppose the more popular is moving to the Division I. The state thought it was just a vote of theirs, and they were terribly insulted when we told them it was the vote of the Regents, not theirs. And we had hearings and people, big meetings, letters, more letters than any other time, calls. And
There was a lot of opposition.
oh, yes. And it may not have passed on the deal, but Mike Rounds called me out of the meeting. And he said, this is one for me, and I'll remember it. And so you'll have a card. And I went out and talked to Rudy Neff, and he changed, and I changed, and it passed. And I'm glad it did. I mean, I think on balance, it raised their profile, and then they've done a great job. I mean, they're national champions, so I mean, can't complain about that. What was the other subject?
The opportunity scholarship.
Yeah, that's important, because we had none. We were listed in the North Dakota Plan for Doing Business. It said, where are we gonna get students? Well, we're gonna get them in South Dakota, because they don't do one damn thing to keep their students in South Dakota. And it was right, we didn't have any scholarship. And so Governor Janklow was supportive of that. We worked and we got that deal done, and it was, you have to have a 24 ACT. And so he kept saying, I don't want to fund, I don't want to waste money. People who don't use it, don't graduate. So I asked him to look at what test is on ACT is predictive. And if you have a 24 ACT, 90% of the time, you graduate. So, but Bill Janklow thought that was okay, so that became the number. And it's still today. And so he never got it passed. We couldn't get it passed because, as proposed, it was just the public universities and not the private schools. And so when Rounds came in, I mean, Bill didn't want to do that. I didn't care. I'd do anything that got it passed. But Rounds would, so it went through. We added there, and it's been a great program. It's doing, and then it's a good scholarship. The state waited a little time before it raised the amount, but they've stayed with it. I'm happy with that. That's something that, and then there's the Dakota Corps, which is private funds, so it's kind of a hip pocket scholarship by the governor. It's 4 years of full tuition and fees, but in majors where we'd need those people. Right now, it's teachers, primarily high school, not so much elementary, special ed, those kind of majors, and then nursing, of course. So they have a 4-year commitment, and if they don't do that, it turns into a loan. And so what happens now, because our pay to nurses is 30% below North Dakota and Minnesota, so those people over there pay off the loan, and then they have that commitment to the employer over in Minnesota, the state 4 years, and so and they make 30% more. I mean, it's presentations out of business and gone, but 2/3 of their people left the state. That was just appalling. And we're replacing presentation up at Northerns, which is a good thing, great thing up there. Our hospital was down, a 110-bed hospital, was down to 28 beds, and that's all. It was controlled by the nurses they could get. So that's really being quick for 3 subjects.
Well, we probably got to leave it there because our cameraman has to. We can keep talking, but it won't be filmed anymore. So, well, thank you, Harvey. This was very good.
Well,